So, good morning everyone. As you can hear from my voice, I'm the person you can't miss on any conference, the one who loses his voice. So I'm trying to still give a good performance, but it might be that at a certain point the voice is just gone. Why I'm presenting here on the workshop is the first question, because I will not talk about social movements at all. Also not about protest. My thesis is talking about protest a lot. It's about how the rhetorics of parties might be affected by movements or might have interaction effect, etc. So this paper is a preliminary step, and what I try to understand here is how substantive are these rhetorics parties give us. So are these just cheap talk, as we quite often hear in the media, for instance? If you hear the media talking, especially in the newspapers, etc., then quite often hear that what politicians are talking about is just cheap talk. They are ambiguous in their position, they're shifting it concerning their short-term goals, and therefore what they're saying is not really reliable as a position, or as giving like a clear clue to the voter and information what the party's position is all about. The question I'm trying to tackle a bit here is this an observation which is tenable? Is that really the fact? And is this talk only symbolic? Or could we rather say that it's more related to more substantive policy positions the parties preliminary had as in manifestos? So, of course, we know a lot about party positions in political science, so this is nothing new to the story here. One could even say it's like a core, more or less, of comparative analysis, starting with Downs and then getting all the way to Butch. We know that party positions matter a lot, and we know that party positions are important to know the party's vote, office, and policy-seeking incentives. So this is more or less like a deal we already are aware of. Furthermore, we know that these manifesto positions are an excellent predictor for the policy outputs governments are creating. So back in the 90s, I think Gary King once said it's about 70% of the promises which will result in policies. And a newer review on that shows something comparable. So at the end of the day, more or less, of 70% of the promises made in electoral manifestos will result in policies across a wide set of countries. What we know less about is parties' rhetoric. So we have some stuff on speeches, and the discussion is more or less divided. On the one hand, we have the argument speech making is about symbolizing something. So it's just a short cue that the speech giver is giving to the voter or to the public. But this is not really a real policy content, it's just a symbolic statement. Then we know that sometimes there might see some priming effect, so by talk we could affect the agenda of the public, the issues the public thinks are important, more or less important. And then a final argument is put forward by Bianco in his book on trust, and he argues that parties are especially talking or presenting rhetorics once they made a policy decision which is not in line with what the public wants. And by talking about that, they create or recreate the trust they lost by making the decision, by explaining what they actually did and how they did it and why they did it. On the other hand, we have arguments, especially what Luca was already talking about, from the Policy Agenda project. They're saying that these speeches, as given by the president, or the Green speech here in the UK, they set the government's agenda, and this set agenda will more or less then also result in policies, which are more or less congruent to what they were saying in their speeches. So if we transfer all of this to the rhetorics, the first statement I'm trying to make in that paper is that parties communicate usually with the public not via manifestos and also not via speeches, which they give only when they are in government, but actually via the press. They give interviews, they give statements to the press, they give speeches at party meetings, they give speeches at at public gatherings, they discuss in parliament, they ask questions in parliament, so they have a lot of ways how they could more or less give the vote and information what their policy position is, besides of manifestos and these really institutionalized speeches at the beginning of a legislative period. And I'm trying to show or understand if these rhetorics are pure symbolism, or could we argue that parties provide information which are more or less more reflecting on their substantive manifesto positions they had before the elections. Now, the argument why talk could be cheap, so this is not the argument I'm supporting, but maybe some people would support, that rhetorics are weakly institutionalized or not really constrained. So if you think of a party, you have a lot of members are talking, and these members could deviate from what the party line is. So ex ante, there's not more or less like a leadership control on these rhetorics, but ex post we know that the leader could like punish the politician by more or less stopping his career in the party caucus. Then the agenda is often fixed and dependent from the speaker's interest. So while in the speech the government is deciding what it wants to talk about, if there is an interview, quite often the politician is asked about something, so he's rather reacting than setting the agenda. So that might be the case that in such situations when he dislikes the proposed agenda, he just talks cheap. He just gives symbols, but doesn't reveal like the real position of the party or his own real position. Now on the other hand, and this is the argument I would rather support, is that talk is costly. So when parties are talking or when politicians are giving statements via the press, the public is listening. So the voter is not like closing his ears and not caring about this information. He's listening to that and might be even listening more to these informations than he is actually reading through a manifesto. But because, to be honest, who of us reads a manifesto if he doesn't have to code it? So I think that, like, in a lot of occasions, how we perceive parties and understand their positions, we rather get information which are less costly than reading a 200-page manifesto. We will read newspaper articles, or we will follow the debate in the parliament or whatever. Then parties can frame the discourse on an issue. So I think this is really important, that parties can more or less, by emphasizing or de-emphasizing certain positions, they could somehow track down or control a bit how the whole discourse in the public is perceived and how the policy options are perceived by the public. And then a final argument is that ambiguity is not really profitable. So I don't think that a party who is more or less shifting constantly its position or not really reflecting what it was promising will be not punished by the voter. I think the voter is punishing ambiguity quite harsh, and we can see that if we look into the literature, especially in the European Parliament, for instance. So my argument is more that politicians often follow the party line when they are talking. So the proposed positions they had in the manifestos. It is of course not always the case. So in this case I'm reflecting on the data on the Fukushima disaster, and it's clear if there is like an environmental shock such as the Fukushima disaster, this provides new information to the voter and to the parties, and the chance to update the positions. So in such occasions parties might deviate from the party line they proposed before the election or before the shock, and we wouldn't consider this as cheap talk. The salience of the issue might also be important interaction. So how salient does the party think about that position it is for themselves? So how much are they talking in the manifesto about that issue? Is it a minor issue? Is it a major issue? If it's a major issue, I think they are less likely to talk cheap. And the final one, if you have a bigger party, then it might be that some of your members are just rebelling because they think the party leadership can't control everything what they're doing. So it might be that in some occasions you can just, because you have different interests than the party has as a politician, you could just deviate from the party line. So the data I'm using is the ResponsiveGov data. Sorry. For this paper I'm now using the nuclear energy after Fukushima juncture data. This will be expanded to other issues, but for now that's the data we have and that's the data I'm using. 12 countries are included in this data set. I'm not using Finland because when I started writing the paper the party manifesto positions were not coded yet. This gives me 55 parties across 108 weeks, which results in 3,705 observations. Which parties did we include? So which parties are included in the ResponsiveGov data and coded and where we coded the party positions? It's 5 seats and 5% of the vote share for the national parliament as a general guide, but we have like made case-by-case selection, and also send it out to the advisory board and the country experts. So it might be that in some occasions we have like particularities. For instance, in France we also included the Front National. So it's a bit depending on the party system how we made the decision, but the general rule is 5 seats and 5% of the vote shares. Which actors am I considering as belonging to the party in this case? Only the national government and national legislators. So I didn't include regional party members. I also didn't include members which are sitting in the European Parliament, because the agenda might be completely different and the interests might be different than the ones the national party branch has. How do I measure these party rhetorics? Well, as we have heard yesterday, all of the positions in the ResponsiveGov data are coded depending on the government's position. So everything we code, every event we code is related to the government's initial position. And this is not really comparable, in my occasion, across countries. So the codes are between -2 and +2, with zeros being the middle position, the neutral position, with -2 being a position which is radically more progressive, which means in this case of Fukushima is anti-nuclear, and +2 position is radically more conservative. I recoded these positions as proposed in a paper we wrote all together to achieve a pro and anti-nuclear position. Since these initial positions are not really about pro and anti-nuclear positions, but rather related to the government, they had to change it to make it comparable across cases in my occasion. So this results in 2 dependent variables, 2 count variables, a pro-nuclear and an anti-nuclear rhetoric variable. What events did I include in these rhetorics? All 200 codes in our code book, which will tell you nothing. It's more or less verbal statements, so interviews, etc. I will show you later a graph to get more into detail on that. And then party meetings, parliamentary sessions, election campaigns, public hearings, and other conferences. So all of these events I regarded as being a rhetoric once a politician of a national party or a legislative, of a government party or legislative party was giving a position. So what are my independent variables? So the most important one is the initial manifesto position. Again, coded from -2 to +2. -2 in this case means very anti-nuclear, +2 very pro-nuclear, and 0 is the neutral position again. Then the initial manifesto salience comparable to the comparative manifesto project. So it more or less measures how much space a party dedicated in the manifesto to the nuclear issue. Then the party size, in this case I used an approximation, so this is the number of seats the party holds in parliament, and an overall salience measurement to control for the overall salience of the issue in a relevant country, which is actually how many events we coded per week per country in the ResponsiveGov data. Since it's over dispersed count data, I used negative binomial regression analysis. It's time series data, but luckily stationary, so I used population average AR1 models, and then I used a couple of controls. I can't use fixed effects because my main covariate is a constant. So what did I consider as rhetorics, first of all? So everything what you see here is a rhetoric besides this non-rhetorical action, so it's statements to the media, parliamentary debates, press conferences, assembly speeches, party meetings, declarations, public letters, rally events, campaign events, hearings, unspecified statements and resolutions. And as you can see here, this is just a pure percentage, how much these events occurred across all countries. Statements to the media are really dominating. So in 55.6% of the actions parties undertake within our data are statements to the media, followed by parliamentary debates, then press conferences, and then there's only the non-rhetorical action with 6.1%. So what Tullis once said, that parties mainly talk, seems to be the clear case. For the main part, parties just are talking more or less. So what are the results? I'm just reporting here the AR1 autoregressive correlation population average models. I have some more control models in the paper, but the results are more or less the same. And as you can see here, the manifesto position is for all of these, for the first two models, it's significant. I report here incidence rate ratio, so you can read this as if a value is below 1, this is more or less a negative coefficient in a standard regression analysis, and values above 1 is a positive correlation. So, as you can see here, parties, with every step a party is more pro-nuclear, the chances massively shrinking by 40% to present an anti-nuclear statement. And you can see as well that with every step a party becomes more pro-nuclear in the manifesto, the chances to present a pro-nuclear rhetoric raises by 40%. What you can also see that this is also still present once we control for the salience and the party size. However, the effect is a bit, while it is getting stronger for the anti-nuclear rhetorics, it's a bit diminishing for the pro-nuclear rhetorics, which is actually in line with Green-Peterson and others would say, if parties have a pro-nuclear position and this, the nuclear accident happened, they want to remain silent about the issue. Instead of like increasing the salience for issue where they hold a position which might not be supported by the current situation, and the public might want them to update. The interaction is not significant for the anti-nuclear rhetoric model, so the interaction between the manifesto position and manifesto salience, but barely significant for the pro-rhetorics. Nevertheless, that's not a this result is not a constant, so it's changing across models. So in general, we could say there is no interaction between a party's manifesto position and how much salience it gives to the issue. So what is the conclusion? Are party rhetorics cheap? From what I have found in my paper and how I understand it, no, they are not. They are actually quite depending on what parties presented in their manifestos. The regression results also show that party rhetorics are strong depending on these manifesto positions, so deviations is not the general case but rather an outlier. And the results partly are at odds with the salient theory, because in all the models I have, the party position is the way stronger predicted than issue salience. So I want to change the paper in the future a bit. What I want to include is the future party positions. So at this paper I only used the initial party positions before the nuclear shock. For future papers I also want to use the final ones, but we don't have that codes for all parties. So at the moment this would be kind of not really a strong case. We only have these positions for 30% of all the parties at the moment. Do party rhetorics deviate more once we have a deeper look into their rhetorics? So I wanted to check more from a qualitative design what they are really talking about and how much this is in relation to what they were proposing in their manifestos. And the final one, when do parties deviate from their initial positions, is the essential part of my thesis. So I want to know how much opinion shifts or protest might affect these rhetorics. Yeah, and that's it.